In the summer of 1985, Andy Grove sat in his office at Intel's headquarters in Santa Clara, California, and looked out at the construction cranes of Great America Amusement Park across the highway. Intel was losing money. The company that Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce had founded in 1968 as a memory chip company was being destroyed, systematically and efficiently, by Japanese manufacturers who could produce the same chips faster, cheaper, and at higher quality. Intel's net income had fallen from $198 million in 1984 to less than $2 million in 1985. Factories were idle, morale was collapsing. The company had been trying to fix the problem for 3 years and had failed. Grove turned to Gordon Moore, Intel's CEO, and asked a question. If we got kicked out, the board brought in a new CEO, what do you think he would do? Moore answered without hesitation, he would get us out of memory. Grove stared at him. Then he said, why shouldn't you and I walk out the door, come back in, and do it ourselves? That question, and the answer that followed, is one of the most consequential moments in the history of the technology industry. Intel exited memory chips entirely. It laid off approximately 8,000 people. It redirected every resource it had toward a product most of the company considered a side business. Within a decade, Intel was the most valuable semiconductor company in the world. The question had been simple. The answer had been obvious once someone asked it the right way. What had taken 3 years was finding the courage to ask. To understand why Grove's question was so difficult to ask and so devastating to answer, you have to understand what memory chips meant to Intel. Intel had been founded in 1968 by Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce, two of the most important figures in the history of semiconductor technology. Moore had co-founded Fairchild Semiconductor and had formulated what became known as Moore's Law, the observation that the number of transistors on a chip would double approximately every 2 years. Noyce had co-invented the integrated circuit. These were not ordinary founders. They were the architects of the Silicon Age. Their company's founding product was memory, specifically DRAM chips, or dynamic random access memory. Intel's 1103 chip, launched in 1970, became the world's best-selling semiconductor product. Memory was not just Intel's first product, it was Intel's identity. When people at Intel said, "We are a memory company," they were not describing a product line. They were describing what they believed themselves to be. Through the 1970s, Intel dominated the memory market. The company's technical capabilities were genuine and significant. It was not simply making a commodity product. It was innovating, improving, staying ahead of competitors. The business was profitable and growing. Then Japan entered the market. Beginning in the late 1970s, Japanese semiconductor manufacturers, Hitachi, NEC, Fujitsu, Toshiba, and others, entered the DRAM market with a systematic and well-funded strategy to capture it. The Japanese approach was not based on a superior technology breakthrough. It was based on quality, scale, and patience. Japanese manufacturers invested heavily in manufacturing processes that reduced defect rates below what American competitors could achieve. They priced aggressively, absorbing losses in the short term to gain market share. They had the backing of Japanese industrial policy and patient capital that allowed them to accept returns that American publicly listed companies could not. By the early 1980s, the effect was visible in Intel's results. The company's DRAM market share had collapsed from a dominant position to somewhere between 2 and 3%. Intel was no longer competing effectively, it was losing, and the losses were accelerating. The response inside Intel was what you might expect from an organization that believed its identity was bound up in a particular product. The company kept trying to find a way to win. It invested in new manufacturing processes. It tried to compete on quality. It attempted to differentiate its memory products. It explored partnerships. For 3 years, the company tried every response except the one that the situation actually demanded. The reason was not stupidity, it was identity. Exiting the memory business meant admitting that Intel was not a memory company anymore, and that admission felt, to many people inside the company, like a kind of death. Grove's question to Moore in mid-1985 was, in essence, a trick Grove was playing on himself and on Moore. The logic was this: a new CEO arriving at Intel without any emotional attachment to the memory business would look at the data and conclude immediately that the company should exit. The data was unambiguous. Intel had 2 to 3% market share in a market dominated by competitors who could outproduce and underprice it indefinitely. The memory business was not recoverable. A rational actor with no history at the company would exit immediately. But Grove and Moore were not new CEOs. They had built the company. They had made the decisions that had led to this point. Exiting memory meant acknowledging that those decisions and the strategy that had followed from them had failed. It meant telling 8,000 employees that their jobs were gone. It meant dismantling factories, writing off investments, and abandoning a product line that had been Intel's reason for existing. The question Grove asked, what would a new CEO do, was a device for separating the rational analysis of the situation from the emotional attachment to the past. By imagining themselves as new arrivals, Grove and Moore could see clearly what they had been unable to see while standing inside the organization. That the answer had been obvious for years, and that what had prevented them from acting on it was not lack of information, but lack of the psychological distance to act. The decision that followed was brutal. Intel shut down approximately 7 of its 11 manufacturing plants. Approximately 8,000 people, roughly a third of Intel's global workforce at the time, lost their jobs. The company spent over $180 million restructuring. Grove later described the period as the most difficult of his career. But the decision also redirected Intel's remaining resources toward microprocessors, the chips that execute the instructions in a computer's central processing unit. Intel had been making microprocessors since 1971, when it produced the 4004, the world's first commercial microprocessor. But microprocessors had always been a secondary business, a complement to the memory products that were the company's core. Now, by necessity, they became everything. The shift to microprocessors was not simply a decision to make a different product. It was a recognition that the personal computer revolution, which was underway by the mid-1980s, would require a fundamentally different kind of semiconductor company. Memory chips were commodities. A DRAM chip from Intel performed the same function as a DRAM chip from Hitachi. The customer chose based on price, quality, and availability. Differentiation was difficult. The market rewarded manufacturing efficiency above all else, and Japanese manufacturers had more of it. Microprocessors were different. The microprocessor was not a commodity. It was the brain of a computer, and the instruction set it used, the language it spoke, determined what software could run on it. If a computer was built around Intel's x86 architecture, it needed Intel's chips, or chips that could run Intel's software. The software ecosystem created a form of lock-in that memory chips could never create. IBM had chosen Intel's 8088 chip for its personal computer in 1981, a decision that, combined with Microsoft's MS-DOS operating system, created the standard that would define personal computing for decades. By the time Intel exited memory in 1986, the IBM PC standard was well established, and Intel's position as the supplier of the chip that ran it was becoming one of the most valuable positions in the technology industry. Revenue grew from approximately $1.6 billion in 1984 to nearly $9 billion by 1993. The Intel Inside campaign, launched in 1991, turned a semiconductor component into a consumer brand, something that had never been done before in the chip industry. By the mid-1990s, Intel was not just the world's largest chip company. It was one of the most recognizable technology brands in the world. Andy Grove documented his thinking about Intel's transformation and about strategic decision-making more broadly in his 1996 book, Only the Paranoid Survive. The book introduced several concepts that have become standard in business thinking. The most important was the concept of the strategic inflection point, a moment when the fundamentals of a business change so dramatically that continuing on the current path will lead to decline, and that a sharp turn is required. Grove argued that every major industry goes through such moments, and that the companies that survive them are the ones that recognize them early and act decisively. He also wrote honestly about why strategic inflection points are so hard to navigate. The data that signals a fundamental change in the competitive environment is often ambiguous in the early stages. The people inside the organization who see the change most clearly are often the middle managers closest to the market, not the senior leaders making strategy. And the emotional attachment to an existing business model can prevent leaders from acting on information that in retrospect seems to have been obvious all along. Grove's own 3-year delay in exiting memory was, by his account, a case study in exactly this problem. The data that Intel should exit memory had been available for years before the conversation with Moore. What was missing was the psychological tool to act on it, and the question he asked in 1985 provided that tool. The Intel story reveals something that is easy to state and extraordinarily difficult to practice. The hardest decisions in business are not the ones where the data is unclear. They are the ones where the data is clear, but the emotional and organizational cost of acting on it is very high. Grove's question, "What would a new CEO do?" is not a complicated analytical framework. It does not require sophisticated modeling or external consultants. It is a single question that anyone can ask at any time. Its power lies not in its complexity, but in what it does to the person asking it. It creates distance from the situation, and distance creates clarity. The Japanese semiconductor manufacturers who destroyed Intel's memory business had better manufacturing processes. They had patient capital, they had government support. What they could not do was ask the question that Grove asked because they were not the ones who needed to. Intel survived because its leader was able, at a moment of maximum organizational pain, to imagine himself as an outsider looking in. And what the outsider saw was what the insider had been unable to see, that the answer to the problem had been available all along, and that what was needed was not more analysis, but the willingness to act. Andy Grove became Intel's CEO in 1987, 2 years after the conversation with Moore that changed the company's direction. He led Intel through the personal computer boom, through the Pentium chip era, through the browser wars and the early internet, until his retirement in 1998. He died in 2016. In his years after Intel, he was often asked about the question he had asked Moore in that office in 1985. He never claimed it was a sophisticated insight. He described it typically as a device for escaping a situation that had become impossible to see clearly from the inside. The cranes at Great America Amusement Park, which he could see from his office window during that conversation, are long gone. Intel's Santa Clara headquarters is still there. The company has faced several more strategic inflection points since 1985. Some navigated successfully, others less so. But the question Grove asked Moore in the summer of 1985 remains one of the most useful tools in the history of business decision-making. Not because it is clever, because it is honest. If we were fired today, what would the new CEO do? And why aren't we doing it ourselves?